A very good morning to all of you. And I'm really delighted to be back at the GTS. To come back year after year to see a summit like this grow is really a very good feeling. You are right, Rudra, that I did push it in the early years. I'm not sure it was very gentle, but the fact is really, when I look at the reach and the impact, there's sort of a lot of satisfaction in it. I hope you'll keep growing. I think the theme which has been picked is particularly timely because today technology is very much at the heart of geopolitics. You could, of course, argue that it was always so. It was always so because, whether it was nuclear or whether it was space or the internet or artificial intelligence, it's actually, if you look at the quantum jumps in history, the quantum jumps in history parallel with some time lag quantum jumps in technology. And it's not just in the modern era. You can go back to metallurgy, you can go back to shipbuilding, you can go back to aviation. That is really the story of both human progress and, in a sense, of competitive national politics. And it has led to a number of policy outcomes. Countries have fashioned their national security decisions. They have made decisions about what kind of influence they will get by applications of technology. And it's not just applying technology, it's also sometimes restricting it, it's steering it. In fact, in a sense, when I was thinking about the subject today, I was reminded of my own PhD, which was about 45 years ago. The subject I started off was really how US decision makers who were poised to peak the Manhattan Project. They knew they had something very big in their hands. And they are now debating among themselves, what are the geopolitical implications of this? Have we given too much to the Russians or Soviets at that time? How does it change our strategy to bring the Pacific theater to a close? So the reason I sort of highlight that as an opening remark is really that, when we think today of competitive politics, sharper contradictions, I think we should be more and more cognizant that it's going to be driven by technology and also be visible or be reflected in the technology debates. Now, I had 6 basic points to make today. One, and I say this especially to my own friends and colleagues and people in India, we cannot be agnostic about technology. And we have to stop pretending that there's something neutral about technology. Technology is no more neutral than economics or any other activity, and you may speak about whether it is data or oil, or oil as data as the new oil. The fact is, more and more things are technologically driven, and we need to understand that there's a very strong political connotation which is inbuilt really into technology. Orthodox way of looking at it would be to go into the world of export controls and technology controls, which is still very, very relevant. In fact, in the last few weeks and months, it has become even more so. But even, I would say, technology in terms of how you influence politics and how you actually shape decision-making in different societies. My second point would be, for technology and geopolitics, the obvious big picture context is globalization. If you look at globalization in essence, I mean, what is globalization? It is about economy, it is about technology, it is about mobility. So we have to understand today the globalization big picture is very much at the heart of geopolitics. And it's a false argument to present it as, are you for globalization or against globalization? I don't think today anybody can be against it because it's such a deep reality. I think the right argument is, are you for collaborative globalization or are you for a globalization model which allows domination by a few players? And so how flat or in a sense and how broad is your globalization model? I think that to my mind is the real debate, and that debate is going to be very much driven by technology. And therefore, to my mind, neither technology nor globalization should be considered really economic issues. I think they're very strategic issues. As a political scientist, I regard them as a political science issue rather than an economics issue. My third point, we live in an era where in many ways the Westphalian model of international relations is over. For us, in this era of technological interpenetration, to say that, you know, all states are equal, everybody is a black box, and it doesn't matter what happens inside that black box. It does matter what happens inside the black box. I think we people, especially in India in the last 2.5 years, have woken up to the fact, where does our data reside? Who processes, who harvests our data? What do they do with it? I think that's a very, very key question. And when we look at our partners, whether it's technology partners, strategic partners, political partners, I think the quality of partners and the sociology of partners, I think is a very, very important point. All partners are not the same. And therefore, today, trust and transparency have become key issues. We have, in a domain like telecom, already seen in India the concept of a trusted provider. I think in the digital side, we are going to hear more and more the concept of trusted geographies. So the moment you start talking trusted geographies, the geopolitical connotation of that is very, very clear. My fourth point, just as the Westphalian model has started to become less relevant, obviously when it comes to supply chains, the Nagoya model has also started, I think, to become less relevant. Between COVID, conflict, and climate change, just in time is just too risky. So the world, and I think particularly large countries with deep interests, are actually moving to a just-in-case approach rather than a just-in-time approach. And a lot of economic choices and technology choices are going to be driven by a just-in-case approach. So if you actually have resilience and reliability in supply chains, and you have trust and transparency when it comes to data, I would suggest if you add these two concepts up, you're going to, the outcome you're going to get is a very different geopolitical outcome than it used to be before. The fifth point I would make is regarding India itself. Our sense of technology in the past has been very narrow, and I speak here particularly from a governmental perspective. Typically, if you ask people in government, what's your sense of strategic technologies, they would say, well, defense, nuclear, space. I think that's like 50 years out of date. Today, there's a completely different world there where the building of deep strengths is actually going to determine our capabilities. So to my mind, in a way, what we in India call Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is like a self-reliant India, you can say a kind of an economic strategic autonomy. That is today going to be key for global rebalancing. That big players are going to consciously strive to be technologically more I don't want to be self-sufficient, but technologically more capable, in order for rebalancing to actually take place. And finally, geopolitics ultimately does come down to partners and choices, and with whom do you have what relationship of what consequence. You know, there are different ways you can slice up multipolarity. You can look at multipolarity, you know, who are your key partners politically? Who are your key partners in trade? Who are your key partners in energy? And the answer will always be very different. So when it comes to technology, because technology is going to be a key criteria today, I would say our key partners, and this is an Indian view, this is my view of what should be India's view, which is, I feel, who gives us access, number one, who is our collaborator, and who is our market. To my, to my view, these should be the criteria of, you know, which direction the needle should move. And if you look at India's geopolitical positioning, I would say it should be a kind of a net assessment of politics, of energy, of economics, but increasingly of where our technological interests lie. And our positioning should really give a substantial weight to that technology factor. So let me just conclude by saying that when we speak about the rise of India, the rise of India is deeply linked to the rise of Indian technology. I think Rudra spoke about semiconductors. It could be semiconductors, it could be 5G and onwards, it could be AI, it could be more commercial space launches and satellite fabrication. But in the world that we are in today, I would still say there might be greater disorder under the heavens, but there is more opportunity in that disorder. So once again, thank you all for being here this morning, and it's a great pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you, Minister, for that stimulating set of remarks to kickstart the GTS 2022. As Rudra said earlier, I mean, that really we started this out with your encouragement and support, and the ministry has backed us since then. So we really, 6 years of this enterprise has made the GTS one of the leading forums today in India and increasingly in the world to discuss the technology policy issues. Now, what I thought I'll start by asking you is much has changed in the world since 2016 when we had the first GTS. And the most important change, which you referred to in your opening remarks, was the nature of globalization. So when we say the Nagoya model just in time, or whether it is the weaponization of interdependence, so you articulated this concept, but when you say we are not going to do the old globalization, what is your approach to the new globalization? Is it completely decoupling? Is it about doing everything at home? Or is it somewhat different?
You know, sort of a few caveats there. I'm not sure globalization changed so much after 2016. I think the debates and awareness about the real nature of globalization changed. There were things which were happening up to 2016, which in our more sanguine world, we were complacent about. And a lot of these were, you know, it's actually very interesting if you look at the trigger events, in a way, Brexit was a trigger event. Trump's election was a trigger event. COVID has been much more than a trigger event. It's regular disruptions of the global economy due to extreme climate. But the key to my mind is actually a sharper realization that big production shares, big market shares, big resource shares are all going to be leveraged, and leveraged right in your face. So the idea that everybody was going to be delicate about it and going to have rules and will work out something which is good for everybody, that's not the direction the world has gone. We have actually seen very tough decisions made by some countries. Tough, not in the difficulty of the decision, tough in terms of the impact it has on the rest of the world. So I would, if you ask me, so therefore what kind of globalization? To my mind, certainly many more countries, you need, in a way, much more decentralized globalization. You need many more centers of production. And I cite to you a very obvious example today, which is semiconductors. That the concern in the world about the concentration of production when it comes to chips is very, very apparent. So if you are going to move in terms of de-risking the global economy, a large part of it will have to be to de-risk the technology sources and the production sources associated with it. So when Government of India talks about Atmanirbhar Bharat, the idea of a much more self-reliant India, people kind of, obviously in a politically polemical world, people say, well, you're going back to pre-92, etc. No, we're not. Nobody in their right mind would even think of that. I think what people, the thinking process is really, how do I limit my vulnerabilities? How do I have greater production possibilities in India? Some of it has to do with the risks and the worries about external exposure. Some of it is about our own capabilities. A country like India, it should not have the kind of manufacturing we have today. We are grossly under manufacturing. And when I hear people saying, well, our future is in services, that's simply not true. Our future is also in services, definitely. But you cannot say that we will grow to be a major power and we're going to give manufacturing a pass. And that is why PLI, for example, the strong support which is today being given to different domains of manufacturing is so vital.
One of the features of the last 30 years of globalization was also the world of technology became increasingly integrated, barring the security-related constraints that existed. For example, American venture capital in China, Apple's production in China, the links between Silicon Valley and China, that's what produced the explosive growth. Two things have changed. I think one, the US-China conflict. The other is the recognition, as you mentioned in your speech, that you cannot simply leave everything to a dispersed chain. Therefore, you need to have some capabilities inside.
No, Raj, I think it's more than that. See, when the debate moves in the direction of civil-military fusion, when you say, this belief that there are technologies and activities that are benign and we can compartmentalize it, and there's that tough world which is a national security world, and there's this nice world where market economics, it will be business as usual. I think that belief has collapsed. You look, our actions, for example, regarding apps in 2020, was actually driven by a concern of where is our data going. And as I said, where our data going is no longer a matter of business and economics. It's a matter of national security. So I would say in an interesting way, because everything has become, everything is being weaponized in this world of ours. So I have to change my approach to the extent of where I should be protective about my interests. I have to define my protective zone in a much broader sense. Now, obviously, no country, can really be an island. So, which is where trusted partners and trusted providers and trusted geographies come. So, there would be partners where I would have the confidence that, to a fair degree, not an absolute confidence, that there will be, shall I say, the possibility of misuse of my data would be much less, because there would be safeguards in those societies or those governments or those economies. There would be countries where it would not be there, and those will be partly influencing my choices.
If you go back, I think one of the tensions in the framework that you identified is how much internal, how do you develop your internal capabilities? Because without those capabilities, you can't really navigate the world of technology. But at the same time, the need for partnerships, the need for engaging trusted partners. For example, if you go back to the 60s, India was among the first countries to develop, electronics all across Asia. Homi Bhabha, under the Department of Atomic Energy, started the Electronics Corporation of India. But then we turned to complete self-sufficiency, and we lost a lot of the ground. So today, when you're talking about semiconductor manufacturing in India, bringing people, collaborating, so is that a fundamental change from turning inwards to one where we collaborate with the partners so that our capabilities grow and it's also mutually beneficial to our partners?
The last time I was in DC, we had a meeting in which there were people from the semiconductor industry there. And one of them said that their estimate, and it was a conservative estimate, was that there were 40,000 Indian engineers employed by American companies when it came to the field of chips. So the fact is, there is already at an industry level a fairly deep connect. And it's a connect which is in other parts of digital business. It is there in other industries as well. The world of policy, the world of politics, the world of national security cannot be divorced or cannot be in conflict with what is there, in a sense, on the street. My sense, again, I don't want. You look in this country, because of this model which gave us so much grief by the time we reached 92, the protectionism is a very easy word to throw at somebody and to kind of delegitimize or to put them down. But in the name of not being protectionist, it mustn't be that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Surely a country like this must have capabilities. Surely there must be, there must be an industrial policy, there must be a national security policy, there must be a national security industrial policy. I think it's important to get the balance right. It is also, it should be fair not to, as I said, use these throwback images to advocate, a deindustrialized India as a disarmed India. And which one of us wants to see unilateral disarmament in this competitive world?
Okay. If you go back again to the 60s, when much of the advanced technologies began in India, our first reactor, including the research reactors, one was American, one was Canadian. Our first power reactor was an American General Electric. Our first satellite was built by Ford Aerospace, and Ford doesn't exist, but the space program has grown. So somewhere we went, some things happened which kind of broke that initial enthusiasm between, US supporting us, and then the 74 sanctions.
Yes. It's an interesting point, because I wanted to keep my initial remarks short, so I didn't come to that part. Look, what happened was the geopolitics of that era broke the connection. Or didn't break it, it diluted it very substantially. Today, we are talking of the impact of technology on geopolitics. I think it's equally important to look at the converse, the impact of geopolitics on technology. That if you get your geopolitics right, in a way, there are a lot of technology benefits. You know, to my mind, it is essential if India is to grow. You know, in the history, at least in modern history, everybody has grown in partnership with somebody else. Everybody. There's nobody, you know, who sort of did it autarkically and.
So what from Germans?
Yes, right. So we have to see today, you know, where are our interests and who are the partners we should have. And that is why I said, to me, my definition of our long-term partnerships is really where is it that our technologies and our capabilities will grow, which means who gives you access. And they will only grow if it's a business, which means therefore who gives you business. And they will grow when there is a human collaborative connect, because at the end of the day it is all up there. So where is it that there's actually a living bridge in technology? And to my mind, the answers are as plain as the nose on my face.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the, you know, it's quite clear that, look, one of the things we did after 2019 when we walked out of RCEP was also to disconnect with the Chinese technology world. Our 2G, 3G, 4G, you know, grew on.
That started from 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the RCEP was 2019.
Yes, the RCEP.
And the 2020
yes, right.
onwards and during the pandemic. Now, looking at this the new phase, I mean, how do we see the role of the private sector? You know, I think because if you look at the old age, I mean, it was really G to G. Much of as a developing country, much of the technological development was really done in the government departments or government labs. But today, we've seen, for example, in space, how quickly the Indian private sector has responded to PM's appeal, we need more private sector. So is the state today, the government of India, ready to encourage the larger role of the private sector, whether it's nuclear, semiconductors, whether it is space? How far and how fast can you push this policy?
You know, I don't think there's a single sweeping answer, but if you sort of factor in the undulations, I think yes, overall, I mean, after all, what is the purpose of the production-linked incentives? It is actually to initially encourage businesses in various areas to invest and create production capabilities, and along with the production capabilities, the larger R&D ecosystem which would go with it. If you ask me, in recent times, I would certainly say the progress which has been made in regard to building 5G capabilities, which is completely, you know, there may be some really smart PSUs, you know, the government-owned companies involved in it, but it's largely a private sector. You mentioned space. I think you will definitely see that in the semiconductor space, that the semiconductor space will finally be it's a private, you know, it's a business-dominated space. But the government has a role. It's a government's job to provide a kind of enabling environment. I mean, just getting out of the way is no longer enough. Yeah. You know, that's a expectation of the government of a pre-92 era, you know, where please do not interfere with me and let me do what I want. Yeah. I think today businesses would be rightfully expecting a much greater support from the government, because that's really what's happening in the rest of the world. I mean, if you look at key technologies, I mean, you look at some of the recent legislation passed in the United States, and the entire East Asia has always been heavily government supported anyway. So I think we need to look at what, you know, peer players are doing.
Because, you know, many times, you know, Indian, you know, policymakers keep talking about who's giving us technology. But in the case of the US, technology is owned privately, and the IP is owned privately. So therefore, the question of developing mutually beneficial terms, that becomes quite critical, rather than handing over handing over to the, you know, US handing over to us, but really that.
Yes, but Raj, I think the conversations of those days are now behind us. I mean, when I look at, say, supply chain conversations today, when I look at some of the critical emerging technologies, because, by the way, a lot of this gets discussed in the Quad. Some of it is discussed on supply chain resilience. We, the Japanese and the Australians, have a group. A lot of it is direct discussions which we have sometimes with European partners, definitely with the United States. So I don't, that kind of technology demand conversation has gone. I mean, obviously we would like technology to flow, but it's a bit like investment. I mean, there's a clear understanding that you got to earn it.
Now, if you mentioned Project Manhattan at the beginning. I mean, one of the first things after the 45, what the Americans did was to cut off Britain, so their best friend and partner, out of the nuclear cooperation. So today we see, look, the US is emerging as the most important partner for us. But given our past experience, there is a lot of distrust whether, the US will once again impose sanctions. We've gone past that, many of the technology sanctions regimes. How do you make sure that the nature of this engagement would be mutually beneficial so one side can't, unilaterally terminate it?
No, look, this question of yours takes me back to some of the debates on our nuclear deal. And the honest answer is, between sovereign states, at the end of the day, no agreement, no assurance can ever give you permanent comfort, on a uncaveated basis. At the end of the day, it's a function of the state of the relationship. Now, yes, there were experiences, especially after 74, but I would then turn it around and say it's the same United States which has been our most forceful advocate for joining the NSG, joining the MTCR, joining Wassenaar, joining Australia Group. So, finally, it's about the politics of the day. And the politics of the day has changed profoundly. Otherwise, you would not have Quad. I can give you other examples as well. So I would today make my technology calculation. If I remain, I'm not saying history is bunk, okay? History has a utility. But if you are constantly extrapolating difficult experiences, then, we are actually limiting our own possibilities. Now, that is, that term which Prime Minister Modi used about hesitations of history. That hesitation of history is this suspicious mindset, which says, I had a bad experience once, therefore, I will never cross the road again. That's not the way we are ever going to rise.
So it's really as you mentioned in your opening remarks, finally, this is about statecraft. This is about actually creating domestic capabilities, as well as navigating a world that is, not benign or always benign. That it is a question of developing leverages to negotiate with others, so that we keep advancing in a competitive world.
It's a competitive world which we can sometimes convince ourselves is benign, but it is fundamentally competitive. But in a competitive world, it's not a Hobbesian world where it's all against all. I think like in civil society, international relations is also about making relationships and building, the rules and the ability to work together. And I would say that today, for me, some of the really interesting possibilities. We've just started engaging on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So where does IPF take us? Because, I saw a lot of kind of immediate knee-jerk judgments saying IPF, there's nothing to it, there's no FTA component to it, it doesn't discuss tariff. It's not even meant to, the US in this regard has been very upfront with all its IPF partners. But there is a big technology element, there's a big supply chain element. So you have IPEF, you have Quad, there are a whole lot of bilateral discussions with different partners, and I do think that in many ways, and there are big debates going on in our own country. I mean, you've already had on the semiconductor, the first agreement between Foxconn and Vedanta. My expectation is in the coming months, you will see many more agreements in that space. And today, this diversification of production, this is, we missed the bus the first time. I think we have a chance of boarding maybe not the same bus, but certainly a significant sort of opportunity for manufacturing, especially on the electronic side, is coming our way. I mean, a lot depends on how smart we are about it.
See, I think what you're doing in the Quad, I mean, the critical and emerging technologies, the trusted supply chain networks, etc., that's been at least visible publicly. But you also signed this Trade and Technology Council with Europe. So what are your expectations on that? I mean, Americans and the Europeans have also signed. What are your goals for the council with the Europeans?
To be honest, we haven't had our meeting thereafter because, partly the Ukraine war has kind of sucked up all the oxygen there in Europe. We will be hopefully doing our meeting at some point. So we've been far more engaging on IPEF. I mean, not out of intent, out of circumstances. Than we have on the TTC with EU.
One of the interesting things, I mean, the last couple of days, you had Japan, UK, Italy signing an agreement to develop a fighter aircraft. Normally, you'd think the Japanese will go with the Americans. So there are multiple cross-cutting alliances that are emerging. Are we prepared to...
You have this Rapidas in Japan. I mean, that itself, if you look at those Japanese companies involved, is a big development.
So in the end, it comes down to what you said about, that a rising India must necessarily be a rising technological power. Mm-hmm. So in the process of building that capabilities, I think the need to expand R&D within India, is there going to be some incentive so that we can only become one if the scale and intensity of research and development in India can really expand?
Look, I don't have jurisdiction on it, and it's not, I cannot say anything in terms of government intent, but it's certainly, I think, a natural part of the debate. For us today to do production-linked incentives itself was a big step, because, as I said, we had reached a stage where conventional wisdom was we shouldn't be manufacturing. So we are turning this sort of ship around. But my sense is there will be many more debates, because we are looking really at a world where whether it's technology to some degree, whether it is energy, governments are getting more interventionist and are giving greater support in different ways, creating stronger enabling environments in their respective societies. So this debate cannot be just a debate within India. It has to be within India too, but it will also be impacted by what's happening with the rest of the world.
One of the things you said, one is to bring technology home, connect our market to technology producing other countries outside, as well as generate our own technology. But it's also about taking our technology abroad, right? I mean, you've been on the vaccines issue, on today, on digital,
even on defense, even on defense, because we do defense licensing, that part of it, I have some visibility of it from the foreign ministry perspective. So you see a lot of very interesting players, smaller companies, very energetic in defense, and very often, to be very honest, I haven't heard of 99% of these newer players. So it's only when you see the licensing that you start actually figuring out what's happening. So there's a lot happening out there.
The other aspect, I mean, I think as the nature of the technological revolution unfolds, the old rules are being reset globally. I mean, I think what were negotiated in the multilateral domain, for example, on the Outer Space Treaty, I mean, the kind of understandings that were developed in the late 60s today are not valid as human capacity to explore space, and the contestation between the major powers expands into space. So how effective is our participation in shaping those rules? Because it's interesting, in 67, when Outer Space Treaty was being negotiated, India actually was among the drafters of the treaty. But today, as the rules change, are we ready to build those coalitions, which you talked about, and actively shape the new rules under which the outer space environment is going to be managed?
I'd, in a way, give you a broader answer than outer space. I think what we are going to see, if you're going to see an intensification in big power competition, many agreements of the past will not continue. We've already seen that in the last few years. Okay, the agreements which have not been renewed. It will become much harder to have new understandings which impose constraints, because the overall, I won't say mood, but the overall outlook is much more sharply competitive. So at the end of the day, you reach these understandings because everybody kind of takes a haircut to create a landing point. I think that willingness today to let go of your leads is less and less across domains. So I am generally not terribly optimistic about new understandings actually on a multilateral or a plurilateral way on the technology side, because the world is the entire world's foot today is on the accelerator. To do a understanding, somebody has to pull up the brake.
I think as we look ahead, I mean, I think it's not pure multilateralism, but like-minded coalitions are the ones that are going to actually, where we participate with our trusted partners to shape the rules of the international system, rather than the UN or some other global body.
Yes, but those would be more collaborative and promotional. Like-minded partners will not impose restrictions among themselves, because the one who's not like-minded then has a free pass. Yeah. The like-minded partners usually will, when they meet, will talk about how to enhance each other's capabilities.
I think, I've kind of overshot my time. We can just go to the floor for a couple of questions. Maybe we'll take 3 questions from both sides, and then we will then after that bring, so anybody here who wants to ask a question? Yeah. Anirudh? Yeah. And there are microphones, I believe, on both sides. Those of you who want at the back, you can go to the left flank or the right flank to ask a question. Yeah.
Thanks, Raja. Hi, good morning, Minister. So I actually wanted to ask you if you can elaborate more on the piece that you mentioned around climate, right? So much like technology has been shaping geopolitics and vice versa, my own sense from your remarks and my own sense is that climate will start impacting geopolitics and vice versa a lot more in the coming decades. So we'd love to hear more of your views on that, how you anticipate that. And related to that, the question comes, how can India start to develop its capabilities on the climate tech side, not just on the internet, semiconductor, AI tech side, so that we become a key player in that aspect of technology also in the coming decades?
Nivruti, I mean, you had any question to the Minister? No. Anyone at the back who wants to either go to the microphones on the side? There's someone there. Yes, sir. Okay. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah. My name is Rijul Sachdev. I'm from IIIT Bangalore. So, Minister, I really enjoyed your presentation. I just had a quick question.
Can you speak up a bit?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. So, you talked a lot about trusted areas and economic collaboration as well as technological collaboration. But I was just wondering, I mean, considering the G20, where India is taking on a presidential role, What happens between a system, say like the EU GDPR and the draft data protection bill, where, I mean, in the GDPR, the penalty is 5% of the global turnover, whereas in the draft data protection bill, it's a very set amount. So in situations like that where privacy is potentially violated, how can you possibly manage to achieve a balance?
Okay, we'll take just one more. Is there anyone else? At the back, right at the back, one of the younger people there. Right at the back, yeah. You can move to the left. It's going to be blinded. Make it brief, introduce yourself. And,
Sure. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Minister, for your keynote. I just had a short question regarding India's position vis-a-vis technology and how we're looking at G20. And just before that, introducing myself, I'm Prathit from Council for Strategic and Defense Research. I wanted to ask that where do we see our regional potential in terms of India as a regional partner? And we know that this G20, we have pledged to present the South-South cooperation in the priorities of the South. Where do we see India's potential as a regional partner in terms of technology sharing, in terms of data? Are we looking forward to prioritizing that in the G20 and the upcoming initiatives? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, we had 3 comments. Yeah, you can.
First of all, on climate, we are actually already seeing the impact of climate events and climate change on politics. I'll give you a very interesting example. The big debate today is, would Europe be able to survive the winter from the energy perspective? And obviously, Europe has tried to figure out solutions which are different from their previous habits before February 24th. But one factor in all of this is it's been an unusually warm year in Europe. And that's had a very big impact on actually their energy consumption. And it has a very obvious consequence for their calculations and their political stance as well. We ourselves, it was interesting in 2020 when we were confronted, with a challenge on subsector north in Ladakh. In fact, again, it happened to be that year. Unusually warm period, which actually enabled many of our divisions to move up, which if had taken a statistical probability, it would have been much colder and more impassable at that time of the year. But these are kind of a trend line. But we are also going to have catastrophic events. We've seen, you look at the floods in Pakistan. So, and if catastrophic events happen in production centers. Now, the catastrophic event can be climate, but, as we saw, it could be COVID. So, when you have concentrated production today, you're actually putting the entire world at risk. And in the de-risking, pandemics is a lesson to learn. Conflicts, if a passage through, say, Black Sea becomes a problem, that is a risk as well. But I would argue that increasingly extreme climate will also, and because it will be a more recurring issue, would be a worry. On the climate tech, yes, you can see from 2014 that there's been a very sort of different kind of approach to the climate change challenge. Different kind of approach in terms of our policies, our advocacies, our energy mix, but it's a bit like digital and telecom. In a sense, the one who has the least of the established systems has the ability to actually embrace new possibilities. So I do feel that when it comes to climate tech, India today has a range of possibilities. It can be a lab, it can be a application field, it can be a generator of technology, So it is an area where, and again, you can actually see a lot of new businesses when you go to a COP today, you actually meet Indian businesses in climate, which as a previous attender of COP, I can tell you was not the case. So this is like, and we are seeing this, it could be defense, it could be digital, it could be climate. There is a different a whole sort of energy out there. On the, how do you get the balance, on the digital? Look, I think what the Indian system today is doing is trying to find a balance between ease of doing business on the digital side, between privacy, and between national security. And they have to find the kind of a right kind of mix here. Now, the Indian system today does sort of put out its draft legislation and invite the world to come in with its views. And I'm sure those debates will happen, and there'll be discussions, including obviously in the parliament on this issue, and get this right. So, people will always have views whether we are getting the right balance. That is natural. But it is certainly the endeavor of the government to get that right balance. The last question, the region and what can we do and G20. Look, in the last 3 years, have traveled fairly extensively in the global south, in Africa, in Latin America this year, meet a lot of my counterparts out there. A lot of them, one of course was the whole COVID story, the vaccines, the platform, the fact that we got a vaccination program, such a big one actually done. But there's a lot of interest in actually digitally enabled delivery. I was actually sitting with a president in the Middle East, and his, this was almost like it was like deja vu. He was complaining about leakage. He was saying, this much money leaves my capital and that much goes out there. Now, this sounded terribly familiar to me. And he was asking, saying, look, I heard about how you people have actually improved service delivery, benefits delivery, capability delivery with the help of a digital backbone. And when you look at our numbers, I don't think even within the country, these numbers have sunk into the minds of people. When you look at Garib Kalyan, the food program delivers to 800 million people, day in, day out, 800 million people. The putting the money in the bank delivers to 450 million people. If I take tracking any scheme today, when I travel, one of the things we do politically is actually at a meeting say, please tell me how many people have benefited from which scheme. We can actually track really who's getting the benefit of how many schemes, and who's the eligible person and who is not. So there's a huge interest in the global south today at India's digitally enabled delivery system, because it's actually a way today of creating a social safety net, which 5 years ago people would have said a developing country cannot afford to do. So it's actually broken that fundamental presumption that social security is actually a wealthy society's prerogative. Digital can actually bring down your costs so massively. That both the costs due to leakage, savage, but more than that, the fact that it's a very targeted delivery. So I think in the G20, we'll still be firming up our priorities. priorities through a process of consultation. But certainly I can tell you this, that India would like to use its G20 presidency in many ways to reflect the interests and the concerns today of the global south, because we feel that those have been sidelined, and not just become a voice, but in many ways a kind of an exemplar, that we would like to take into global south what we have tested and delivered, performed and delivered at home.
Thank you, Minister. I think all good things must come to a close, and the opening session. I think what you said today, a rising India must necessarily be a great technological power. You outlined 6 broad principles under which this, both internal development, it's coalition building, it's taking the technology to other countries, or sharing it with the like-minded countries. All these factors, and I'm sure Carnegie India is going to work into these principles, and I think it's not often we get a good articulation of the policy in relation to technology, given the speed and the scope of the technological change that's going on in India and in the world. Your comments today, I think, are really welcome, and I think give us some guidance to take us forward. So thank you. Please join me in putting your hands together for the minister.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister and Raja, for setting the canvas for the debate at GTS. I personally believe that Minister's remarks are a very good curtain raiser for the many discussions that we have planned during the day. Please remain seated as the Minister leaves. Just a small housekeeping